We were discussing earlier, and in response to Ulrike's discussion of the definition of a cosmopolitanism, whether it's possible or not, the writer I'll be talking about was very much preoccupied with this idea of trying to figure out definitions and theories, and I'll kind of argue that he was a bit lost along the way. But then that's kind of given, I guess. Atilla İlhan, the person I'm going to be talking about today, is not translated, at least not that I know of. But what makes him, I think, important is that, well, he was a prolific writer, he was a prolific poet, and he wrote a lot about issues of national consciousness, of the intellectual, of an idea of national literature or representations, realist representations of literature. So he was of that sort of fully blown intellectual types that did a little bit of everything. So we see both in his non-fiction and fiction work that he is trying to reconcile certain polarized ideas, ideological points, whether they are a kind of an Ottoman culture or a nationalist republican revolution. Mind you, the abstracts you have in that little booklet appears to be a little bit misleading because it kind of seems to be suggestive of his nostalgia from Ottoman cosmopolitanism, which kind of at first glance kind of stands out. But essentially, he is not a very cosmopolitanly oriented person. He's actually, if you kind of dig deep into his work, you realize that he's actually quite anti-cosmopolitan because he's quite fond of his idea of the national consciousness, the national revolution, what Atatürk had done in Turkey, and he is actually criticized for being quite fond of Atatürk himself as a person in terms of his ideological representations, right? So he does have quite a few novels with Atatürk as a person appearing in the story, okay? So, renowned with his poetry, Atilla İlhan is a prolific writer in various genres, including essays and novels. His multitude of essays, compiled in numerous books, is the manifestations of a highly active intellectual life. His intellectual and political interests in dialectical materialism, issues of national consciousness, and the cultural synthesis to represent late to post-imperial Turkey expands as far as an Asian Muslim communism a la Sultan Galiyev, which is one of the main points that he's criticized against as well. His novels in their social realism and historical materialism, marked by an influence of the Frankfurt School, bear the traces of his political stance. Whilst his political stance makes his novels a challenge to the literary tradition of the period, his ideology is not without his problems and is criticized by his contemporaries such as Fethi Naci, who points to İlhan's excessive ideological dependency on Atatürk's person. Yet for better or worse, İlhan does provide an alternative voice to a polarized discussion on the transformation of the country and the society from an empire to a republic. Whether he manages to reconcile the polarization between the imperialists and the republicans is arguable, obviously, but it is interesting to see the so-called progressiveness or the conservativeness of the set poles as they are taken for granted to be challenged. Okay? With its complicated political formulation, combining Marxian ideas with a strong and to some extent conservative nationalist stance, İlhan's approach to cosmopolitanism presents some interesting points and contains serious political complications. As a devoted admirer of Mustafa Kemal and his Republican Revolution, Atilla İlhan is very much preoccupied with the idea of a national synthesis. He persistently argues for it for a true sense of independent Turkish cultural identity. However, he's not willing to let go of some aspects of the country's imperial past either, such as the Ottoman language or culture. One of his rare criticisms of the national modernization project is its absolutist severance from the Ottoman past. The multiculturalism of the imperial background that is manifest in the cosmopolitanism of the urban space is thus something that the novelist seeks to recreate in his novels, as his social realism amply provides him with the appropriate techniques. What İlhan's national synthesis seeks bears the pitfalls that lead to the confusion in his approach to cosmopolitanism stated earlier. To put it somewhat crudely, Atilla İlhan is very critical of the idea of cosmopolitanism, and it's rather obvious in his fiction as well as his non-fiction work. However, despite such strong criticism, his works also reveal an underlying admiration for the diversity and cultural richness that the cosmopolitanism entails. Examining both his fiction and non-fiction work would enable a better understanding of the intellectual and political complexity at hand. There are two main paths to such an examination. The first one is the intellectual formulation of the previously mentioned idea of the national synthesis in its interaction with cosmopolitanism, imperialism, and universalism. The second one is about the literal representations of İlhan's ideas, whereby characters become the mouthpieces of varying ideational worlds. In both his essays and his novels, Atilla İlhan focuses on a strong sense of national consciousness that is a product of the National Revolution and the War for Independence. His Ulusal Kültür Savaşı, the National Culture War, in particular, is a key work in trying to understand his attempts at forming a national synthesis that would be an outcome of such national consciousness. In these essays, he points to the Western society, developed from its feudal roots to a bourgeois society, and how the Turkish national synthesis would need a similar developmental process of its own, shaped by the relationship between its base and its superstructure. He has two aims in underlining the socio-economic scheme of the dialectical materialism. First of them is to highlight that if there is going to be a strong Turkish national identity, it will need to be born out of the Anatolian lands and cultures, i.e., a local perception of a universal methodology. Secondly, he criticizes the erroneous approach of the Ottoman Turkish intelligentsia and the bureaucrats who see Westernization and the imitation of European cultures as the way forward in the modernization of the country. With the latter, his ideas parallel those of Frantz Fanon in their anti-imperialist radicalism that is critical of the post-independence national intelligentsia in the colonial contexts. Both İlhan and Fanon are highly critical of the middle classes and their intelligentsia due to their superficial understanding of their position within the social structure. Fanon notes that the national, and I quote, "the national bourgeoisie will be greatly helped on its way towards decadence by the Western bourgeoisies, as they think they can advantageously replace the middle class of the mother country." İlhan's view is not very different, as he defines the late 19th century Ottoman intellectuals, bureaucrats, and the bourgeoisie as being comprador classes, who mimic the Europeans with admiration, but are essentially useless in understanding their own nation. According to him, the crucial problem is that in their attempts at modernization through a superficial sense of Westernization, they are too estranged to their own culture. Following a somewhat traditional approach to the novel genre in his social criticism, in his novels, particularly the seven novel Aynanın İçindekiler, Those in the Mirror series, said Atilla İlhan depicts such characters. For instance, Abdi Bey and Gülistan Satvet Hanım, of the various works in the series, these characters keep popping up in different novels all the time, are the Ottoman Turkish bourgeoisie who, upon misconceiving the idea of progress, degenerate into the travesty of the Turkish modern ideal. They are superficially westernized and have picked up the corruptions, particularly sexual corruptions, of the Europeans as represented by the Franks and the non-Muslims in Smyrna or Constantinople or the various Ottoman cosmopolitan cities. However, the two intellectuals diverge in their suggested solutions to the anti-imperialist problem of this idea of the cosmopolitanism. In Pitfalls of National Consciousness, Fanon emphasizes the need to move from national consciousness, which, according to him, is a travesty of what it might have been, to social and political awareness. And I quote, "Nationalism is not a political doctrine or a program. If you really wish your country to avoid regression, or at best halts and uncertainties, a rapid step must be taken from national consciousness to political and social consciousness." From a Marxist viewpoint, he underlines that only by the achievement of a consciousness that enables the controlling of the economic tools, such as the forces of production, the native can achieve a true independence from the colonizer. Otherwise, it's merely the illusion of an independence that goes skin deep, lacking true control over self-determination. İlhan is fully aware of the Marxian argument of the base and the superstructure, obviously, which he advocates at all times. However, his solution to the problem diverges from the universalism of the Marxist ideal. He notes in National Culture War how this very idea of universalism bears within it pitfalls along the lines of it carrying the values of the white, Christian, European, post-Enlightenment world, a valid anti-colonial argument as universalism has been criticized to have such consequences. İlhan, therefore, proposed a local version of the ideologies in question. He argues that whatever the country needs will come from its own cultural geography, and he argues for this point as far as an Eastern Islamic synthesis. İlhan's national synthesis bears elements of the Seljuks and the Ottoman cultures, alongside Persian and Arabic influences. However, it's also inclusive of the Byzantine traditions. As he argues for what he calls homeland patriotism, a kind of a dubious terminology, These various layers of the Anatolian cultural palimpsest will not be a repetition, as he says, but an amalgamation, a supplementation of those Persian, Arabic, Anatolian, Ottoman, Byzantine, and Seljuk cultures. What stands out in this perception of a synthesis is that there's a certain sense of cosmopolitanism. Right? It's obvious. The naturally characteristic diversity of the Anatolian lands are a form of cosmopolitanism that İlhan seems to encourage. It is mainly the European, and this is in quotation marks here, European cosmopolitanism that he has bones to pick. For him, the term cosmopolitanism means a tricky universalism based upon a hierarchy of cultures and values whereby the so-called West bears the torch of civilization. Accordingly, it's a minefield for national identity and national determination, supported on the shoulders of a comprador Occidental intelligentsia. İlhan is very careful about differentiating between westernization and modernization as such, which associates with differences in the policies of Atatürk and İnönü, and I can easily say that he is a bit of an anti-İnönü type Kemalist, let's say. İlhan sees the embedded imperialism within the traditional conception of cosmopolitanism as a threat to national determination, and thus, despite his interest in cultural diversity, he comes out conservative ideologically. Coming back to the question of the misleading title and the abstract which are proposed, the problematic initial presumption arises from İlhan's novelistic writing. Writer of many novels set in different periods in Turkish history as well as other settings, from Paris to modern Turkey, the diversity of characterization reveals a tendency to cosmopolitanism on the author's side. I mean, he spent a lot of time in Paris, you see. He was imbued with that Parisian cosmopolitan culture. Beginning with his first novels like Sokaktaki Adam, The Man on the Street, and Zenciler Birbirine Benzemez, Negroes Don't Look Alike, which are outside his historical Those in the Mirror series, a particular attendance to urban diversity and multiculturalism can be seen. The influences of his French experiences mark his dark yet romantic cosmopolitan cityscapes. The former set in Istanbul, the latter in Paris. The common point in these two works is that the characters are from various national, ethnic, religious backgrounds thrown together due to their individual life circumstances, that almost all his novels, whatever their storyline or setting might be, establish a fictive world that encapsulates a cosmopolitan diversity, is in a way a literary tribute to a yearning for a multicultural world, one that has lost hold in Turkey, obviously. In The Man on the Street, for instance, a variety of people from different backgrounds is brought together surrounding a fur smuggling deal. Beginning with this first novel, the dark alleys, brothels, alcohol-ridden lives are the kind of images of the city repeated in almost all his works, following onwards. People like Triandophilos Ahmet, Hasan, Yakub, Leon, Bünyamin, Rachel, Armenians, Jews, Turkish Greeks, and Turks and Greeks and the Franks, from various regions of the country come together in a dark Istanbul in an unknown time, possibly 1950s or 60s. The smuggling plot revealing sailors, obviously as characters, and their acquaintances amongst the lowly people and prostitutes, bartenders, etc., has a convenient element of being mobile and not belonging to a single place, identity, or any other form of social existence. As such, without a neat justification to such diverse characterization, the world of the sailors, the everyman in the novel, become representations of a cosmopolitan world, whereby multifarious identities survive together with their differences, for better or worse. Istanbul as a city keeps these people in its bosom. They seem to detest the place, but cannot leave it either, much like the depictions of passionate love affairs İlhan likes to have in his novels. Not unlike the mobile world of the sailors in the previous novel, in Negroes Don't Look Alike, the novelist picks a peculiar world to tell his story once again. The setting is once again a multicultural cosmopolitan one, that of Paris this time. The majority of the characters in the story are outsiders to the city, coming from different backgrounds and finding refuge in each other's otherness, hence the title, Negroes Don't Look Alike. These are the kind of people who make the city of Paris what it is, that it is cosmopolitan. And not unlike, again, the previous novel setting, the cosmopolitanism is very much about being in an urban world with an attractive darkness, bars, immigrants, refugees, women, alcohol, prostitutes, and all sorts of lowly, illegal types. These cosmopolitan elements are the main patterns in all of İlhan's novels. Despite his ideological criticism of the concept, he's clearly preoccupied with cosmopolitanism to the extent that his novels become its embodiments. Yet what that cosmopolitan image entails is where his ideology takes precedence over his interests and becomes manifest in two main portraits, public and private, that underline the undesirable consequences of a cosmopolitan society. Whether the novels are set in the Ottoman period or the Republican one with minor reference to the Ottoman past, in the private sphere, the cosmopolitan character manifested in non-Muslim peoples revolves around taverns, parties, balls, alcohol, drugs, bold sexual experiences, both hetero and homosexual, edging at various perversions. In almost all the works in the historical Those in the Mirror series, the modern Ottoman bourgeois characters relate to their non-Muslim counterparts, mainly Armenians, Jews, and Greeks, including visiting Europeans, obviously, in some sort of sexual/private relation that would be or / is unacceptable to the Turkish woman / character. So you have this kind of constant depiction of these cosmopolitan worlds, but there's always this conflict between a very cliched Eastern-Western view. As such, cosmopolitanism, as represented by the varying Ottoman bourgeoisie, is a form of moral degeneration. One novel outside Those in the Mirror series, called Hacı Hanım Vay, or Oh My Hacı Hanım, or something like that, in particular is an epitome of this representation of the cosmopolitan degeneration. Set primarily in Damascus and Izmir, the main character of the novel, young Hacı Hanım, is depicted as being forced into homosexual relationship with the second wife of an Ottoman bourgeois man, Emrullah Raci Bey. She's saved from her demise by the military doctor, Feridun Hakkı, an upright, patriotic, idealist Ottoman official. Aside from the obvious symbolism in Feridun's characterization, the critical portrayal of marginal sexual lives means something beyond the moral conservatism here. All the various characters from Rachel and Rosa to Abdi Bey and Gülistan Satvet, the so-called modern, Western characters of the various novels in İlhan's oeuvre, are posed against idealistic characters like Munif Sabri or Ahmet Ziya as degenerated and perverted. If the issue was of moral conservatism, the anti-cosmopolitanism of the novels could be somewhat understandable. However, in his non-fiction writing, İlhan does encourage diversity in cultures and experiences, as well as a sense of individual liberty, particularly sexual liberty. Therefore, the real problem arises not from conservatism in regards to sexuality, but the contradiction in his ideas and his literary depictions. That such degenerations almost always attached to the cosmopolitan, non-Turkish or westernized Turkish subjects further complicates the level of contradiction. A similar contradiction prevails in the depictions of the public sphere in its relation to the cosmopolitan empire with its so-called minorities. Once again, İlhan is supportive of a multicultural world. However, when it comes to the Ottoman cosmopolitan character, ideologies take precedence. The contradiction this time comes from the fact that the novels set in the Ottoman period, such as Dersaadet'te Sabah Ezanları, Morning Calls for Prayer in Dersaadet, or the others within the same series that has references to it, however minor, all revolve around nationalism and the Turkish war for independence. Accordingly, within that historical context, the elements of the Ottoman cosmopolitanism are deemed as threats to national determination. As such, the varying non-Muslim or Western public space experiences, like parties and taverns, are presented as breeding grounds for disloyalty, and the Westernized Ottomans, alongside non-Muslim minorities, appear as traitors of one sort or another. Paralleling the depictions of sexuality in the novels, and there are quite a few parallels, believe me, cosmopolitan environment is established as a darkly colorful, but an unreliable one. As such, the contradiction manifests itself as a certain attraction to the cosmopolitan nature of the society with no outright animosity directed towards it, and appreciating the marginalizing diversity of the other, yet coming home to a somewhat romanticized Philistinism in the end. So, the point is, to sum up basically, the seeming mistake in assumptions regarding İlhan's approach to cosmopolitanism arises from the fact that he seems to appreciate the diversity of cosmopolitanism itself, inclusive of his personal past in Paris, obviously, and apparently he had a bit of a wild background there during the 60s of Paris, so it kind of tells a lot about the man. Yet, ideologically, he's obviously against it, as he's supportive of a multicultural national synthesis, something that sounds awkward and contradictory anyway. In short, it could be said that Atilla İlhan personally appreciates the diversity of a cosmopolitan world, but is ideologically uncomfortable with its early theorizations. The irreconcilability comes from the anti-imperialist engagement of Marxism with anti-colonial nationalist movements and the nature of cosmopolitanism that provides a comfort zone for imperialism to flourish. Consequently, the complexity of what İlhan is trying to achieve is making him difficult to achieve it in the end. Thank you.
Thank you.